That night, when the darkness settled like a veil draped over the memory of humanity, a thin beam of light, as soft as mist, opened before the eyes, carrying a feeling both unfamiliar and strangely known. In that quiet space, the narrator saw an ancient scroll hidden in the margin, not on the main page, but tucked in the place where human eyes rarely look. It felt as though someone had intentionally slipped a truth out of humanity's sight. On the cover of the scroll, the numbers 400 and 2019 rose, glowing like sparks, waiting for a breath of wind to ignite. When the scroll unfolded, a deep voice sounded from afar, not loud yet full of authority, reminding that history does not follow the calendar of man, but the appointed moments of God. A vast space seemed to open. The narrator saw the image of an old prophecy from the days when Abraham walked among grains of sand. That prophecy spoke of a lineage dwelling in a land not their own for 400 years, suffering heavy oppression, then stepping out with great possession. The prophecy was not poetry, not metaphor, but a contract written and sealed in the heights of heaven. The narrator saw the number 400 like a fiery clock counting seasons, centuries, and every sigh of a people rising from the ocean. Then a shoreline appeared, dark wooden ships, heavy with bodies, cries that could not form words, cold chains clinking. Each figure forced onto a ship looked like a stone statue torn from the soil it belonged to. The narrator saw that this was not only sorrow, but the moment the 400-year clock began to run. And though many argue dates and definitions, though history has changed names and adjusted meanings, the truth inside the revelation stood clear. A circle of time had begun not from Jamestown alone, but from all the shadowed ports where ships from Africa were pulled into darkness. As that clock moved, a spiritual court opened. No gavels struck, no arguments rose, only the silence of heavenly records, capturing every action of humanity like unpaid debts. Every drop of sweat, every silent prayer, every soul torn from family was gathered as evidence. The scene made the narrator understand that though humans may change laws, shift punctuation, and alter words, God does not revise his timeline. And the due date of that contract does not sit on the Gregorian calendar, but on another schedule where the year 2019 glowed like a sign of movement. The narrator saw events stringing together like lightning, traveling backward from present to past. Economic tremors, social upheavals, and the long pressed down through generations rising slightly as if pushed upward by an unseen strength. It was clear this was not randomness, not coincidence, not chaos, but the beginning of a transfer buried in the margins and in the words people thought no one noticed. In that revelation, the narrator saw a bright band across the sky like a golden thread. Inside that thread was the title, The Empires and Their Judgments. Though their names had changed through centuries, their essence had not. And the 400-year clock was like the final mark in the journey of powers built on blood and sweat. What the narrator witnessed was not chaotic collapse, but an order written long ago. That order brought both a chill and a sense of release. As the golden thread dimmed, a soft yet unmistakable reminder echoed. When the appointed time is full, everything hidden in the margins will be brought to light. Every altered line, every shifted comma serving power, every torn page of history will return to its true place. And that day will not only be the rise of truth, but the lifting of those once despised back into the light of an ancient promise. That moment was the beginning of the story. When the 400-year clock rang its spiritual bell, the heavens began to open a path for a new era, an era in which The things buried beneath oceans, beneath history, and beneath the consciousness of the descendants of Africa would rise like seedlings breaking through the earth. As the revelation continued to expand, the scene around the narrator turned into an ancient desert. In that place, the wind moved through strands of sunburned grass, and the first figure to appear was not a victim of the slave ships, but Abraham standing beneath the sky with eyes looking farther than the horizon. The deep voice the narrator had heard before rose again, gently reminding that this was the beginning point of a covenant between heaven and earth, a promise that time could not erase and empires could not alter. Abraham stood before the narrator, saying nothing, only turning his gaze toward an open space where a field of grass was shifting its color. In that moment, the words once recorded in Genesis appeared in the glow, speaking of a lineage that would dwell in a land not their own and endure bondage for 400 years. After that, they would step out with great wealth, not through negotiation, not through mercy, but through the intervention of God, the one who never forgets the debts written in the heavenly ledger. When the scene faded, the narrator saw the surface of the sea darken. The wind blew backward, carrying the damp salt in the size of a people pulled from their homeland. The narrator saw not only Jamestown of the year 1619, but also the earlier fleets of Portugal and Spain serrated ships, crawling across the water like beasts carrying living cargo. And on each ship were eyes that had lost names, lost freedom, lost the soil that had once held their roots. The narrator saw an important truth many overlook. The 400-year clock did not begin by human choice, but at the moment the hand of the invader touched African flesh on the first port. From that moment, time began counting seasons, cries, and prayers without sound. And across the vast ocean, the narrator saw the souls of millions poured into the water, not destroyed, but transformed into silent witnesses, holding the records of heaven in place of the years humans tried to hide. Then the scene shifted to a new land. The narrator saw sugar fields, plantations, and bodies thin and weary laboring under the sun. Not in one place, but across the Americas, from the Caribbean to Brazil, from Virginia to Louisiana. And strangely, in every place, the narrator saw a faint light clinging to each person. That light was dim, but never extinguished. It was the promise, the covenant, the spiritual seal placed upon the lineage of Abraham. The narrator understood this clearly. Though they were torn from their homeland, stripped of language, and forbidden from keeping their roots, the covenant never disappeared. The promise followed them across the ocean into the wooden shacks, into each generation born in foreign soil. Even in labor songs, in forbidden drums, in trembling melodies of slaves, the narrator saw the memory of the promise surviving in silence. As the scene turned, the narrator saw the numbers appear again. The number 1619 hovered above the water. Opposite it, the number 2019 glowed like a beacon. Between those two numbers lay 4 centuries of blood and tears. But the most terrifying thing for empire builders was not the 400 years of oppression, but the due date of the prophecy. That date was not on the calendars of governments, not tied to political change or elections. It belonged to a spiritual timeline only heaven could open. The narrator saw that in the year 2019, cracks formed across the surface of the great power systems from economics to politics. And in the year that followed, the entire world seemed to pause, creating a space for the transfer to slip through those cracks. The narrator understood that a transfer never begins with noise. It begins with small tremors that only those with spiritual sensitivity can detect. Those who wake in the middle of the night, those who feel an unnamed pull when watching the world in chaos. Those who sense they are standing at the threshold of something larger than personal history. In the revelation, the narrator also saw another truth. The empires built on African labor now stood at the edge, not because of outside attack, but because of the widening cracks within. Strong currencies had weakened. Laws once unshakable began to bend. Power systems that once overshadowed the world were now threatened by the exhaustion of their own soul. The narrator saw one final image before the revelation closed. On the sea, where ships once carried millions in chains, a pathway of light stretched forward. That path pointed toward the future, and a gentle whisper drifted through the air. The enslaved lineage will not only come out, but will come out with wealth, for that wealth was written into the covenant from the beginning. And no contract written by heaven can be undone. Allow the narrator now to ask you something. When you look at your own history or the history of your ancestors, do you sense any mark from heaven? Have you ever felt something approaching, like the footsteps of an old promise returning? When the vision carried forward, the desert winds of the previous scene faded and a different atmosphere rose. It was heavier, thicker, as if the air itself was swollen with secrets long held back. Before the watcher unfolded the immense panorama of human kingdoms, each rising in the brilliance of its own pride, each sinking beneath the weight of its unseen debts. There were no crowns, no banners, only the faint outlines of power structures that once commanded the world and now trembled like towers built on sand. In the center of this shifting landscape stood an image of a golden scale suspended in midair, measuring not grain nor silver, but time. One plate held the centuries of labor taken from a people. The other held the wealth of empires that had fattened themselves on that labor. For generations, the scale had seemed uneven, but in the vision it began to tilt slowly at first, then decisively, as if something ancient and righteous had finally reached its appointed hour. Then the watcher was shown the currencies of nations once mighty, now fragile. Their symbols glimmered like coins heated in fire. The pound, the euro, the dollar all appeared not as instruments of strength, but as parchment that had been soaked in water too long, cracking, peeling, losing their shape. They pulsed with a faint sickness, a quiet rot that began at their centers and crept toward their edges. The watcher understood that the sickness was not inflation alone or debt alone. It was the moral corrosion that comes when wealth is built upon the backs of the oppressed. While this unfolded, shadows of old empires drifted across the scene. The outlines of ships, flags, and parliaments swayed like ghosts. Babylon appeared first, its towers bright but hollow, trembling under the memory of judgments written in the unseen realm. Egypt followed the weight of its stone monuments, unable to hide its history of forced labor. Then Rome, with its marble arches and iron grip, now cracked down the middle as if struck by an unseen hand. The watcher realized these were not simply memories of nations long gone. They were patterns, blueprints repeated across the ages. Every empire that fed on stolen labor eventually choked on its own excess. Each one believed itself invincible until the hour of unraveling came. And in that unraveling, the same cry rose from the earth, a cry of those once crushed, now rising in strength. Then the scene shifted. Modern financial institutions appeared like towering structures of steel and glass, but inside them were trembling wires of light. They flickered as if overloaded. At their base, the watcher saw tiny cracks forming. Central banks whispered behind closed doors. Policymakers spoke with worry disguised as confidence. And beneath it all, the same truth echoed. Systems built on exploitation do not fall because of minor mistakes. They fall because the foundation was never clean to begin with.
BRICs appeared next in the vision not as political entities but as shifting continents of light. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa formed a new pattern, a counterweight rising against the old order. Their movement was not chaotic. It was deliberate, as if guided by a tide older than any human agenda. And at their center, Africa glowed with a deep, steady radiance, as though the continent was awakening from a long imposed sleep. The watcher understood then the transfer of power was not merely financial, it was civilizational, it was spiritual. Something long suppressed was pushing upward like a seed breaking soil. Nations that once extracted were weakening. Nations once dismissed were gathering strength. In the next moment, the watcher was taken closer into the rot of the currencies. The dollar flickered like a candle near its end. Paper broke apart, and behind it was revealed a hollow core. The pound shrank, losing mass. The euro trembled like a branch too dry to bear its own leaves. These were not merely economic symbols, they were spiritual indicators, signs that the systems which held dominion for centuries were losing breath. And as their brightness dimmed, another illumination rose. It came from the people once pushed to the margins. It came from communities whose ancestors had been taken across oceans. It came from those who had learned to survive with almost nothing and yet kept their soul intact. This illumination did not flash. It glowed. It was resilience made radiant. The watcher saw boardrooms, once closed, now trembling, policies, once rigid, now bending, structures, once impenetrable, now loosening at their joints. And through the cracks of these declining systems flowed something like wind, a current of change, moving in the direction of a people who had been counted out by every earthly measure. At this moment, the watcher was shown the merchants of the world. They stood at a distance, hands over their faces, watching the wealth they once hoarded lose value. They did not weep from compassion or remorse. They wept because their profit was dissolving. The imagery was not metaphorical, it was exact. It was the same pattern sworn long ago in ancient texts. Wealth built without justice eventually turns to sand in the hands of those who gathered it. Then came the final movement of the vision. The watcher saw a great wind sweep across the map of the world. It erased no nations, it toppled no cities. Instead, it revealed what had always been true. Foundations built on righteousness endure, foundations built on blood tremble. And in the trembling of the latter space is created for the rise of those long pressed down. As the vision faded, one truth echoed in the watcher's mind. Kingdoms built on sand may glitter for a season, but when the weight of divine accounting is applied, they cannot stand. And our that accounting has begun. I was taken into where memory did not flow in straight lines. Time folded like cloth, and I walked through scenes that belonged to different centuries yet pulsed with the same wound. What I saw was not the rise of wealth, but its constant interruption, a repeated pattern that revealed the hidden war beneath human history. It was a war waged not only with weapons, but with ink contracts, laws, and signatures that carried the weight of chains. The first scene opened before me like an old photograph coming to life. I stood on the coastlines of the American South just after the Civil War. The air was thick with the dust of newly freed people who believed the morning of deliverance had finally come. I watched as land was surveyed and divided. I saw promises carved into official orders, 40 acres and a mule for every family, a redistribution that seemed small to the world but enormous to the souls who had carried centuries of unpaid labor. For a moment, the promise glowed with the brightness of a dawn. Families built homes. They planted crops with a hope so fierce it felt like heat rising from the soil. But as I watched, the glow dimmed. The paper that held the promise was taken from the hands of the righteous and rewritten by the hands of those who feared equality more than they feared God. I saw signatures, reverse troops sent to remove families at gunpoint land, returned to the very men who had fought to keep others enslaved. As these scenes unfolded, I felt the sorrow of heaven press upon me, not because the work of justice failed, but because the pattern was ancient. Every time a door opened for liberation, another hand tried to close it. What happened in that era was not the collapse of an opportunity. It was the interruption of a transfer that had already been marked in the unseen realm. And I understood then that an interruption is not a cancellation. It is a delay in the visible world, not in the eternal one. I stood in Greenwood, Tulsa. The year was 1921, but the air felt like the edge of a storm that had been gathering for generations. Black Wall Street rose before me, vibrant, alive, a masterpiece of economic strength built without permission from any earthly empire. I walked past doctors, offices, grocery stores, banks, newspapers, all created by people who had turned suffering into strategy. What I saw next moved slowly, as if time itself did not want to bear witness. A mob formed, fed by hatred and fear, and moved toward the community like a spreading fire. I saw bombs dropped from above, flames climbing walls, bodies fleeing. I saw wealth accumulated with dignity being raised in hours, and I saw insurance claims, denied records, buried graves left uncounted. But beneath the violence, I sensed something deeper. The attempt to destroy wealth was also an attempt to destroy identity, confidence, memory, and the belief that black prosperity could exist without permission. Then the vision carried me into other towns whose names history rarely speaks aloud. Rosewood, Wilmington, places where the pattern repeated with dreadful accuracy. Prosperity rises, threat forms, destruction follows, and the silence of the official record tries to seal the wound. But in the realm where I stood, silence had no power. I saw the events not as isolated tragedies, but as footprint principality, a dark intention that moved through centuries wearing different faces. Sometimes it wore a hood, sometimes a uniform, sometimes a judge's robe, sometimes the quiet language of policy or the sterile tone of yet the intention was always the same: interrupt the transfer, keep the oppressed from reaching the inheritance that had been ordained for them since the beginning. The vision expanded again. I saw hands signing mortgage denials for families with perfect credit. I saw banks drawing lines around neighborhoods, lines that looked like invisible fences. I saw highways designed to cut through thriving communities. I saw laws written in courteous language that masked their cruelty. I saw courtrooms where justice tilted toward wealth and away from truth. Each act was small in its moment, but in the realm of spirit, they formed a single shape, a beast made of policies and paperwork. A question formed within me. Why did the darkness work so tirelessly to interrupt these transfers? And the answer came not as a voice, but as a knowing. Because wealth was not merely economic, It was psychological, cultural, generational, spiritual. If a people learned to build freely, they would learn to rule freely. If they learned to own, they would learn to refuse subjugation. And if they learned to think generationally, the world that exploited them would never rise again. Then I was shown a different kind of warfare, quieter but more devastating. I saw the crafting of narratives that painted Black achievement as accidental or unimportant. I saw textbooks that cut out entire chapters of history. I saw children growing up unaware of the strength in their own lineage. I saw statues of those who oppressed standing tall while the descendants of the oppressed walked beneath them, unaware that the symbols were designed to shrink their sense of possibility. I understood then that the interruption of wealth was always paired with the interruption of memory, because if you sever people from their past, you weaken their future. As the vision neared its end, I felt a shift. The darkness that once moved freely now trembled. Its strategies were no longer hidden. Its patterns were being exposed. Its power depended on secrecy, but the hour of revelation had begun. Every injustice recorded, every theft noted, every interruption logged as evidence for the day when the scales would be fully balanced. And in that realization, I understood my purpose in the vision, not to despair at what had been lost, but to witness that nothing had been forgotten in the places where eternity keeps its records. When the scene finally dissolved, a quiet truth remained with me. Every interruption in history was a sign of how dangerous the transfer truly was to the powers that ruled the world. And if the old interruptions are now being revealed, then the new transfer is already underway. The vision moved again, and I found myself standing at the edge of an ancient landscape where scripture and history blended like two rivers meeting at a single point. The air trembled with the weight of words spoken thousands of years ago, yet still alive. Before me rose the long corridor of Deuteronomy, a gallery of blessings and curses unfolding in slow procession. They did not appear as text on parchment. They appeared as living scenes written not with ink, but with memory, consequence, and destiny. The corridor opened first to the curses. They were not violent in appearance, but they carried the gravity of sorrow long endured. Each verse shone like a dim lantern revealing a pattern. I saw ships rocking on dark waters, carrying bodies pressed together like grain in a storehouse. I saw land not their own, a language they did not understand, and a relentless hand shaping their days with chains. Verse after verse matched the history of a people scattered across oceans. These scenes unfolded not as metaphors, but as exact reflections. When I came to the verse that spoke of being returned to Egypt in ships, a chill passed through me. In the vision, Egypt did not appear as pyramids or pharaohs, but as the entire system of bondage that had risen again in the New World. The ships that crossed the Atlantic matched the prophecy with precision. The auctions, the families torn apart, the despair that sat heavy on the soul, all of it stood beside the ancient text, as if the prophecy had been written in anticipation of this very chapter of human history. Yet even as the curses stood in their grim alignment, I sensed an ending to their power. It was not indefinite. It had a boundary of verse, count a divine perimeter drawn around suffering so that it could not stretch beyond what had been appointed. The watcher in me knew that a curse with a number can end, but a promise without limit endures. Then the scene shifted. I was carried into Deuteronomy 30. The air brightened as though a window had been opened to let in morning light. The words, "Restore your fortunes," appeared in the sky like a banner lifted by invisible hands. "Gather you again" rose beside it, vibrating with the force of a command. These were not gentle suggestions. They were decrees. Decrees that, once spoken, could not be reversed by any earthly power. The vision widened, and I saw a map not of nations, but of scattered hearts. They pulsed across the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, and islands whose names the world does not speak often. Each pulse represented a descendant of those who'd endured the Middle Passage. Then the pulses began to move. Lines of connection formed like glowing threads weaving across continents. What I saw next startled me. It was not migration, it was remembrance. A remembering of origins, language, rhythm, and identity. DNA tests appeared in the vision, but not as medical instruments. They glowed like keys, unlocking doors in the minds of people who had long felt a nameless longing. I saw individuals discovering tribes, regions, and lineages they had never known, and as they did, the threads of connection brightened. This was not science alone, it was prophecy returning to fulfill itself. Ghana appeared radiant as though crowned with a soft golden light. The year of return was not merely a tourism initiative in the vision, but a spiritual summons, a ripple moving through the diaspora and awakening dormant memory. People stepped off planes with tears they did not fully understand, as though ancestral voices whispered welcome through the soil. Then the African continent rose like a giant, stretching its limbs after a long night. 54 nations forming the largest free trade zone in the world by land and by population. The continent was not rising because others weakened. It was rising because it was time. There was no arrogance in its ascent, only momentum, the kind that follows prophecy, the kind that awakens when the curse has reached its boundary and the promise has reached its hour. As I watched, I saw other signs of gathering that were subtle yet powerful. Land trusts forming, cooperatives growing, diaspora returning not as tourists, but as builders, African nations seeking reparations from European institutions instead of blaming themselves, the continent beginning to speak with one voice, a voice steady enough to shake the old world without raising its volume. Then a deeper layer of the vision opened. I saw dreams, not dreams of ambition, but dreams people had been having at night. Dreams of rivers with names they could not pronounce. Dreams of forests their families had not walked in for generations. Dreams of drums echoing through the mind like distant heartbeat. These dreams were not emotional fragments. They were spiritual memories resurfacing. The promises of Deuteronomy were not only external, they had been written inside the descendants, and at the appointed hour, those memories began to wake. I felt the ground beneath me shift and became aware that the promise of restoration was not merely geographic. It was internal. It was the healing of trauma passed through bloodlines. It was the return of confidence lost through centuries of imposed inferiority. It was the lifting of shame that had never belonged to the oppressed but had clung to them like a shadow cast by someone else's sin. The vision carried me into a higher vantage point. I looked over centuries as though they were pages in a single book. The curses were long, heavy, filled with tears, but the restoration chapters glowed brighter and longer. Suffering had boundaries. Restoration did not. The curses were written in human history. The promise was written in eternity. Then a final scene rose before me. A great gathering
that did not take place in one location, but in many. People who had been scattered by violence were now gathered by awakening, not forced together, but drawn by an inner pull. I saw communities rebuilding. I saw languages returning. I saw cultural memory piecing itself back together. I saw faces lifting with the recognition that they were not abandoned by heaven, but preserved for a purpose. And I heard within the vision a truth that did not require sound. The curse is counted. The promise is not. The curse ends. The promise unfolds. And the hour of unfolding has begun. A strange stillness settled over the realm, as if the world itself paused long enough for its inner machinery to be revealed. What rose before me was not a landscape of mountains or cities, but the hidden architecture of global finance stretched out like a vast and intricate body. Numbers coursed through it like veins. Contracts pulsed like organs. Policies shimmered like membranes, struggling to hold their shape. Everything that held value in the world was suddenly stripped down to its bare frame. Light began to spill across this structure, illuminating the places where value was created and where it silently evaporated. The first waves of illumination revealed the great monetary expansions of recent years. They did not appear as paper currency or digital entries. They surged as tides of pale light rushing into the system, only to dissolve into gray mist. The more these waves rose, the more distorted the structure became. Wealth did not rise uniformly. It concentrated in already swollen chambers while the rest of the body thinned into near transparency. Inflation walked quietly after the flood, slow and deliberate. It brushed its hand across wages, savings, and household budgets. Cash wilted wherever it touched, yet assets hardened and grew. It became clear that inflation was not merely an economic force. It served as a silent mechanism of redistribution, a siphoning from those with the least toward those who already held advantage. Nothing about it was random. It behaved like a design coded into the system itself. Then another layer of the structure opened. Gold glimmered beneath it, not as bullion or bars, but as an ancient substance of weight and integrity. Basel III rose above this metal like a ledger of reorganization. When gold was lifted into the highest tier of financial assets, something subtle shifted in the balance of power. Nations that had once dismissed gold as a relic now found themselves holding promises printed on paper while others held the metal itself. Western vaults glowed with claims. Eastern and African vaults glowed with substance. A realization settled over the realm like snowfall. Those who hold paper inherit the illusion of stability. Those who hold substance inherit the next era. Another structure pulsed to life. Lines of digital light wove themselves together, forming a web that sprawled beneath every nation. Code replaced physical currency. Networks replaced borders. Bitcoin appeared as a single ember burning with an honesty that seemed unbothered by the world around it. Formed shapes that looked like constellations, branching and expanding with each passing moment. This emerging realm was not governed from a central tower. It grew like a forest, organic and resilient. In this coded world, people long excluded from traditional banks moved freely. Migrants, the unbanked, the ignored, those denied loans by systems that did not speak their names. They found access through screens rather than counters. They found financial existence not through permission, but through participation. Necessity
made them pioneers. What the wealthy considered risky, the marginalized recognized as opportunity. Then the shadows thickened and revealed a different development rising in the space above. Central bank digital currencies appeared as tall, gleaming structures. They promised efficiency, security, and modernization. Yet their foundations vibrated with conditions. They allowed the source to restrict how money was spent, where it flowed, and whether an individual could access it at all. A single command could freeze accounts, another could erase balances, another could dictate expiration dates on spending. These currencies were not instruments of freedom. They were instruments of control shaped to look like progress. A quiet truth emerged. The future would not be defined by one economy, but two. One visible, monitored, obedient gleaming with artificial clarity. The other hidden, decentralized human built on relationships, barter bullion, and digital assets beyond the reach of central manipulation. The visible economy sparkled like polished glass, but trembled at its foundation. The hidden economy moved like a slow wind, steady and unbothered by surveillance. A moment of collapse flickered across the structure. Trust not money was the first thing to fall. The visible system flickered like a lamp losing oil. Lines of confidence snapped one by one. Yet beyond those snapping lines, the quiet, resilient economy continued to trade and grow. Those who had prepared found themselves untouched by the tremor. Those who relied upon the old system felt the ground shift beneath their feet. Gold began to flow from hands that feared the future into hands that understood it. Digital assets moved from the impatient to the disciplined. Land passed into the ownership of those who valued it not for profit but for survival. Every shift in ownership, every change in control behaved like pieces of a larger mosaic rearranging themselves in preparation for a new era. Communities emerged in the half-light, practicing skills thought outdated by the modern world. Families grew food again. Young people learned to code not for entertainment but for autonomy. Villages repaired tools instead of replacing them. Elders taught the wisdom of storing what endures. Small cooperatives rose in cities and countrysides, linking households into networks of mutual strength. These acts appeared humble, yet they were the architecture of a rising world, a world being built inside the shell of another, a world for people who refused to trust systems that had failed them again and again, a world growing quietly while the old order exhausted itself. A final revelation settled upon the structure as it dimmed. Collapse would never be the true story. Exposure would be. The fading system would not end simply because of mismanagement or deceit. It would end because its foundation was empty. And when that emptiness could no longer be concealed, the world would see who had built their lives on the vanishing glow of credit and who had built theirs on the immovable bedrock of wisdom, discipline, and community. For when the dust settles, the wealth of the next age will not belong to those who held the most in the past. It will belong to those who prepared in the quiet hours, who learned to stand apart from dependency, and who built a life strong enough to inherit what is coming. There was a stirring in the air like the tremble before dawn, a quiet signal that something long withheld was beginning to rise through the fabric of the present generation. It did not come as a loud movement or sudden revolt. It came as awareness growing inside young minds, one by one, until entire communities began to feel the shift. What emerged was not simply frustration with the world. It was clarity a clear recognition that the systems built by previous eras could no longer contain the truth or silence the rising conscience of a people who had been scattered for centuries. The first thing I noticed was how the younger generation refused the illusions that comforted their ancestors. They did not bow to narratives crafted to maintain the old hierarchy. They looked beneath every explanation, examined every story, questioned every symbol. They did not inherit the fear that once kept their elders quiet. They were born with an instinct that pointed them toward truth, even if that truth came wrapped in fire. Their awakening showed itself in unexpected places, on handheld screens glowing in dark rooms, in independent documentaries filmed with borrowed equipment, in long threads of thought written by hands that would once have been silenced. They took the gatekeepers of knowledge and pushed them aside without asking permission. For the first time in centuries, history was not traveling from the top down. It was rising from the ground up. I saw teachers in this generation whose classrooms were digital. Their blackboards were social platforms. Their curriculum was lived experience. They told stories of Tulsa and Rosewood with precision stories that many formal institutions still avoided. They taught about redlining, convict leasing, mass incarceration, and the coded language of policy. They uncovered names buried in archives. They lifted up ancestors whose brilliance had been stolen or erased. They made it impossible for the world to pretend anymore. What astonished me was not that the information existed. It was that young people carried it like inheritance, not as bitterness, but as fuel. They understood that knowing their history was not an act of anger. It was an act of restoration, a reclaiming of a narrative that had been stolen, rewritten, and weaponized against them. Then I saw creativity lace through the awakening. Musicians creating songs that carried ancestral truth in rhythmic codes. Writers weaving prophetic insight into fiction and poetry. Visual artists painting scenes of liberation and memory onto walls once meant to suppress expression. Even comedians took part using humor to dismantle lies that had stood for generations. Every form of creativity became a tool for truth. This was not rebellion, it was resurrection. The resurrection of a story that had been buried beneath conquest and propaganda. Another layer emerged. Young entrepreneurs rose with ideas that bypassed the old economy. They built brands from their bedrooms. They created channels of influence without the blessing of traditional institutions. They formed small businesses that grew into movements. They gathered audiences numbering millions, not because they were perfect, but because they were honest. They rejected the requirement to code switch or shrink themselves to fit in spaces never meant for them. They brought their full identity to the table and built tables of their own when old ones refused to expand. In the community spaces of cities and towns, I saw grassroots movements sprouting like plants after rain. Community fridges fed whole neighborhoods. Cooperatives grew from the ashes of abandoned blocks. Local funds pooled resources to help families recover from crises. People who had once been isolated found belonging and shared purpose. These were not acts of charity, they were acts of sovereignty. The more this generation awakened, the more threatened the old order became. I saw institutions scrambling to contain what could no longer be controlled. Books were banned, courses removed, teachers silenced. Legislators attempted to erase uncomfortable truths behind polished language, but every attempt produced the opposite effect. The more the truth was forbidden, the more people wanted to know it. The more it was hidden, the more forcefully it resurfaced. Then I saw something magnificent, a thread of light stretching across continents. It connected young minds in Africa with young minds in the Americas, in the Caribbean, and Europe. Their conversations traveled not by ship or empire, but through signals in the air. They compared their histories and found shared patterns. They compared their challenges and found shared solutions. The sense of separation that once defined the diaspora began to dissolve. In its place rose the awareness of a global family. Africa, in this new connected world, appeared not as a distant land, but as a returning heartbeat. Young people from the diaspora visited, invested, collaborated, and restored bonds broken by centuries of forced separation. They did not arrive as orphans seeking identity. They arrived as heirs remembering their inheritance. And African youth, seeing their counterparts return, began to reclaim pride in their own cultures, languages, and brilliance. What surprised me most was the rise of a new leadership style. It was not hierarchical, it was collective. No single figure led the movement. It moved through many voices, many talents, many callings. It rose through unity rather than authority. It was a leadership driven by contribution rather than title. And because of this structure, it could not be decapitated by removing one leader. It lived in the body, not in the head. As I observed this unfolding, one truth grew louder. The greatest transfer of power was not economic, but narrative. The story was returning to its rightful owners. The people who had once been portrayed as victims reclaimed their identity as vision carriers, builders, healers, and innovators. They did not wait for history to acknowledge them. They wrote themselves back into the book. There came a moment when I saw a great library rising from ashes, not a physical building, but a living archive carried in hearts and minds. When the story is restored, the future is restored. When the memory of who a people truly are returns, no empire can contain them. This generation had awakened, and in their awakening, they had begun the restoration of the story that was taken from them. A story older than ships, older than chains, older than the nations that once claimed dominion over them. A story written in faith, sealed in suffering, and rising now with the strength of a long-awaited dawn. There was a quiet gravity in the air, the kind that settles when a long-hidden truth begins to rise from beneath centuries of dust. It did not come as accusation or pride. It came as recognition, gentle yet unshakable. I found myself standing between two mirrors, one reflecting ancient Israel as remembered by tradition, the other reflecting a people scattered across the Americas and the Caribbean, shaped by suffering, yet carrying a familiar pattern in their bones. Between the mirrors stood a single thread, delicate but unbreakable, connecting what history claimed and what prophecy revealed. This was not a matter of politics or modern arguments. It was older than nations and older than doctrines. It was a question of identity shaped by prophecy, consequence, and covenant. When I looked closer at the first mirror, I saw images painted by conquerors, pale faces placed into ancient scenes, prophets and patriarchs portrayed as Europeans, a cultural editing that had soaked into centuries of religious art and education. It was the casting of a story rewritten for the comfort of empires. But the other mirror showed something different. It showed the descriptions found in ancient texts, Hebrews mistaken for Egyptians. Moses described with features that made Midianite women assume he belonged to Africa. The children of Jacob blending visually with the people of the Nile. When I watched the reflection, it became clear. Israel, in its earliest form, was not the portrait the world had been shown. It carried the tones of Africa and the warmth of the Levant.
It was a people between continents formed by desert winds and sun-carved landscapes. Then the pattern emerged, the same pattern that had echoed through Deuteronomy 28, a people taken in ships, a people scattered among nations, a people losing name, language, inheritance, and autonomy, a people experiencing generation after generation of forced labor oppression and displacement. These were not generic curses. They were specific, detailed, distinct, and the reflection that matched them most clearly was not found in Europe or the Middle East, but across the Atlantic among the descendants of the Middle Passage. This realization was not presented as triumph. It carried deep sorrow, for identity was not being used as a weapon, but as a key unlocking an inheritance forgotten by both the world and the people themselves. The world had forgotten because empires benefited from forgetting. The descendants had forgotten because centuries of trauma had buried memory deep beneath survival. But the covenant had not forgotten. It waited like a seed in fallow ground. As I watched the mirror of the diaspora brightened, I saw communities across the Americas sensing an old familiarity with the scriptures they had been taught. Verses about suffering, exile, captivity, and return resonated not because they were poetic, but because they mirrored lived reality. Their history was the closest echo of the ancient pattern. And slowly, quietly, the question rose in their hearts. What if the narrative they had been given was incomplete? What if their suffering was not random? What if their endurance was the mark of a people preserved rather than abandoned? I saw scholars and elders across oceans beginning to recognize these parallels. African historians revisiting records of lost tribes, geneticists discovering unexpected links between West African populations and ancient Levantine groups, anthropologists tracing migrations that stretch farther and deeper than previously acknowledged. None of this pointed to a single tribe or a single story. It pointed to a scattered people carrying fragments of a shared origin, a people who had been broken to weaken their sense of self, a people who were now reassembling the fragments. The scene widened, and I found myself standing in a spiritual courtroom. On one side lay the misinterpretations that had justified oppression, the curse of Ham twisted beyond its meaning, the belief that Africa bore a divine mark of servitude, the narrative that suffering was proof of inferiority. These interpretations did not originate from scripture, but from empire. They served conquerors, not truth. On the other side stood the covenant itself, unbiased, unchanging. It did not declare a race superior or another condemned. It declared a relationship between God and a people defined by obedience, disobedience, exile, and return. And within that covenant lay the promise that after dispersion and suffering, restoration would come. The courtroom did not rule through sentiment, it ruled through alignment, identity determined by pattern prophecy and spiritual resonance. Then came a revelation that softened the edges of the moment. Identity in this context did not diminish others. It did not strip dignity from anyone who loved God or sought righteousness. It was not a claim of superiority. It was a recognition of calling, a calling passed through bloodlines, through trauma, through resilience. Calling that had been suppressed for centuries, because if the oppressed remembered who they were, the systems built over them would crumble. I saw a scene where young people
from the diaspora read ancient scriptures and felt something awaken in their bodies. They did not know why. They felt a tug, a familiarity, a whisper that the story was not foreign. It was home. Their reactions were not intellectual, they were spiritual. They were remembering without having been taught.
Then I saw the nations that profited from the slave trade trembling as this awareness grew, not because they feared revenge, but because they feared exposure. If the world learned that the people they had oppressed matched the prophetic descriptions of ancient Israel, then the entire moral framework of empire would collapse. Every justification for conquest, every rationalization for inequality, every theological excuse woven into colonization, all of it would be stripped bare.
But what I felt in that moment was not wrath, it was restoration, a restoration both internal and external. The internal restoration came as healing, healing from generational shame, healing from the lie that suffering meant rejection, healing from the belief that history had no purpose. The external restoration came as a shift in economics, a shift in global alliances, a shift in spiritual authority. The inheritance of Israel was never land alone. It was influence, creativity, wisdom,
The ability to shape civilization. When a scattered people awaken, these gifts awaken with them. As the mirrors faded, a final truth settled over space. Identity is not a crown worn in pride. It is a responsibility carried in humility. When people discover that they bear the marks of an ancient covenant, they also discover that they carry the duty to live with clarity, righteousness, and discipline.
their suffering had meaning, their endurance had purpose, their awakening had timing, and the world, knowingly or not, was beginning to turn toward the people whose inheritance had been forgotten by history but remembered by heaven.
There comes a moment in the unfolding of history when the noise of collapsing systems grows loud enough that the wise begin to prepare rather than panic. In that moment, they do not look at the chaos, they look at the pattern beneath it. And pattern now rising across nations is the same pattern spoken long ago to a people who had wandered in wilderness and captivity. Prepare to inherit, prepare to govern, prepare to build what will outlast the world that once oppressed you.
What I observed first was the inner preparation, quiet and invisible, yet essential. The healing of the mind. Generations raised under the weight of survival learn to expect little, dream small, and distrust their own brilliance. That mentality once protected them under systems designed to crush them. But a transfer cannot enter hands still shaped by fear. So the first preparation came as deliverance from the wounds of history. People began confronting internal voices that whispered limitation.
They loosened the grip of traumas passed down like heirlooms. They rejected the belief that hardship was their only inheritance.
Then I saw another preparation forming, this time not inward, but relational. Wealth, in its truest form, is never held alone. It is built through network, trust, and shared purpose. Across cities and villages, I saw groups gathering in living rooms, community centers, and digital spaces. They built circles of accountability, mentorship, and shared learning. They created bonds strong enough to withstand external pressures. They invested time in each other with a seriousness once reserved only for institutions. These networks became the backbone of a new social order that did not wait for approval from the old one. Skill began to rise
next practical and grounded. I saw people learning the crafts neglected by modern convenience: farming, carpentry, mechanical repair, herbal medicine, water stewardship, teaching, negotiation, coding, the skills that do not disappear when systems falter, the skills that anchor a people when power shifts. They were not practicing survival, they were practicing sovereignty. Every new skill learned was a stone placed into the foundation of a coming era. From there, the preparation widened into financial discipline, the kind once mocked by those who lived on borrowed stability. People began building containers capable of holding generational wealth. They studied budgeting not as a chore, but as a strategy. They prioritized assets over appearance. They understood that money flowing through undisciplined hands disappears like water through open fingers. The habit of saving small amounts became the training ground for managing larger blessings. They no longer sought to look rich, they sought to become free. A new form of collective enterprise emerged. Cooperatives formed around land housing, agriculture, and small business. Families pool resources to acquire property. Groups bought abandoned buildings and turned them into community spaces. Farmers formed alliances to protect their soil. Artists created guilds. Tradesmen shared equipment. These alliances grew into economic ecosystems that did not depend on the approval or stability of the external system. The pattern reminded me of an ancient blueprint, the kind whispered through scripture when the Israelites prepared to enter a land that required more than hope. They needed structure, they needed unity, they needed governance built on righteousness. And in many places, I saw that same blueprint reappearing, not through religious ritual alone, but through practical wisdom. Debt cycles broken, skills diversified, families healed, children educated outside the narratives that once diminished them. Then I saw something extraordinary. Small towns and neighborhoods began to transform themselves into modern sanctuaries of self sufficiency. Community gardens replaced vacant lots. Local currencies circulated beneath the radar of corporate systems. Neighborhood watch groups evolved into community care networks. Youth councils formed that could organize hundreds with a single message. These places were not utopias, they were prototypes, early versions of a world rising just beneath the surface of the old. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became that preparation was not only about acquiring resources, it was about transforming identity. A people cannot inherit an era if they still see themselves as subjects of the old one. So I watched as confidence returned to faces that had carried the weight of centuries. They began to walk with the calm assurance of those who know they are needed for what comes next. Their posture changed, their speech sharpened, their eyes cleared. A shift in self perception rippled through entire communities. Then the preparation grew spiritual in nature, not in ritual or performance, but in clarity of purpose. People began to pray with the understanding that their lives were part of a story older than their grandparents and broader than their nation. They asked for wisdom rather than vengeance, strength rather than spectacle. They sought discernment, knowing that every transfer attracts resistance and every rising draws the attention of forces that prefer the world unchanged. I witnessed elders rise with authority, not the authority of title,
but the authority of experience. They taught younger generations how to survive storms without losing dignity. They shared stories once considered too painful to discuss. In doing so, they built mental fortitude. They forged identity. They turned memory into armor. Then I saw children absorbing this renewed confidence. They learned languages their ancestors had lost. They sang songs older than the ships that carried their bloodline across oceans. They saw images of themselves as kings, prophets, artisans, and scholars. They grew up without the quiet shame that once shaped entire lineages. Their innocence was not burdened by lies, but strengthened by truth. In one moment, the realm shifted, and I saw a symbolic city rising. It was not bound to geography. It was a template, a vision of what Black sovereignty could look like when wisdom, unity, and purpose fused together. Its name was not spoken, but its essence resembled the ancient concept of a place called Zion. Not a replica of the past, but a living demonstration of what freedom could construct. Its streets were built on cooperation, its homes on generational ownership, its institutions on justice, its culture on dignity. The message of this symbolic city was clear. A people preparing to inherit must build the world that matches their destiny, not wait for someone else to hand it to them. As the scene faded, a simple truth settled like calm water. Preparation is not an act of fear, it is an act of prophecy. Every skill learned, every dollar saved, every relationship strengthened, every trauma confronted, every blueprint drafted, every community organized. These are the foundation stones of an era that is approaching with the certainty of sunrise. For when the transfer becomes visible, the only question will be who is prepared to receive it. And the ones who prepared in the quiet seasons will be the ones who build the world that follows. I stood in a realm where the weight of centuries pressed against the present moment like a storm gathering its last breath. Nothing moved at first. The air held the stillness of a courtroom waiting for the final verdict. Then I sensed it. The empire that had shaped the modern world was entering its final hour. Not because an army marched against it and not because its enemies overpowered it. It was collapsing from the exhaustion of maintaining its own illusions. I felt the tremor before I saw the signs. The confidence of nations turned to unease. The policies that once projected power now revealed fear. The leaders who once spoke with certainty now whispered behind guarded doors. It became clear that the systems sustaining the empire were no longer upheld by strength, but by momentum, and that momentum was fading. As I watched the world's economies flickered like lanterns running out of oil, the structures that had appeared unshakable showed fractures. The institutions that had survived wars and recessions now bowed under the weight of their own contradictions. This was not destruction inflicted from outside. It was the slow unraveling of a world built on exploitation and denial. I saw people searching for explanations. They blamed politics. They blamed culture. They blamed the poor. But beneath it all, the truth stood unhidden to my eyes. The empire was fading because the season of its dominion was over. Time itself was withdrawing its favor from the powers that had ruled for centuries. In that moment, I felt a great wind pass through the realm, and it carried the voices of ancestors. They spoke without sound, yet their meaning flooded through me with clarity. You are living in the time we longed for but did not see.
You are breathing in the hour when justice ripens. You are walking in the days when the curse breaks. I looked upon the descendants of those who had endured slavery, exile, and oppression. Their faces held the strength of survivors and the vision of builders. For generations, they had been told to wait, to be grateful for small mercies, to remain silent while injustice thickened around them. Now, something within them was rising with an authority older than the empire itself. A truth formed inside me, heavy and undeniable. Those who were once considered the least were being positioned to lead. Those who were once scattered were being drawn together. Those who were once silenced were being entrusted with the story. And those who were once plundered were being prepared to inherit. Then I saw the statues fall. At first, one, then another, and then entire collections of monuments built to preserve the pride of conquerors. They fell not only in physical spaces, but in the minds of people who had once revered them. The collapse of these symbols was more than political protest, it was spiritual eviction, a sign that the old gods of empire were losing their power. When the statues shattered, the lies they carried shattered with them. The myth of superiority, the illusion of divine entitlement, the idea that domination was destiny, these illusions dissolved like dust in the wind, and in their place rose the truth that had been suppressed since the first ships crossed the Atlantic. The oppressed were not cursed, they were chosen to survive. And surviving had prepared them for something the empire could never foresee. I felt the ground beneath me vibrate again as the backlash rose. Laws were written to hide history. Movements emerged to deny truth. Voices shouted to preserve a world already slipping away. But the louder the resistance grew, the more obvious it became that fear, not conviction, was driving it. An empire does not panic when it is strong. It panics when it knows its strength is waning. Then the realm shifted, and I found myself standing before what looked like a massive book open to its final pages. Each page glowed with names, not the names of nations or rulers, but the names of individuals. Ordinary people by the world's standards, families, workers, students, elders, builders. Their names shimmered as though each carried a mandate waiting to be acknowledged. As I drew closer, the pages turned themselves. I felt as though the book was not written in ink, but in assignment. Every name had a call attached to it, a responsibility, a work, a purpose for the era now unfolding. My own name appeared. When it rose from the page, I felt a warmth spread across my chest, not of pride, but of recognition. I realized that I too had been carried through these generations for a reason. The message came to me without words. Stand ready. The world you knew is ending. The world you were born for is beginning. The scene expanded once more, and I saw crowds standing at a threshold between two ages. Behind them lay centuries of sorrow, oppression, and endurance. Ahead of them stretched a horizon filled with responsibility, rebuilding, and authority. The transfer they had been waiting for was not a single event. It was a calling that demanded preparation of spirit, discipline of mind, and courage of character. Power was shifting, influence was moving, wealth was repositioning, and all of it was flowing toward a people who had learned to survive without losing their humanity. The transfer was not reward, it was realignment, justice pulling the world back into balance, I heard a final declaration rise in the air, quiet yet thunderous in its meaning. The curse is broken, the blessing is active, the inheritance is moving. I stepped forward into the light of this declaration and felt it settle upon me, not as a burden, but as a summons, the summons to speak truth even when it shakes the room, the summons to build even when others doubt, the summons to rise even when the old systems resist. Then came the last whisper. Not all will be ready, not all will answer, but those who recognize their moment will shape the age to come. When I opened my eyes, the realm faded, but the call remained. It rested on my shoulders like a mantle handed down through centuries, and I knew that the hour was no longer approaching.